The Park Morton Apartments is a public housing project that's slowly being demolished, and its redevelopment is a long time coming. The Park Morton residents have been waiting for 15 years to move into their new housing accommodations that's been promised to them by the DC Housing Authority and the DC government. The district has said there would be new housing built for residents to live in nearby before their current housing was torn down. Park Morton was called a shining star because of DC's new Communities Initiatives program, a housing program with a progressive approach to overhauling public housing and will be demonstrated in 4 DC neighborhoods. The new Communities Initiative program includes the Berry Farm Public Housing Project in Southeast DC, Ward 8, Lincoln Heights and the Richardson Dwelling Public Housing Projects in Northeast DC, Ward 7, and Sursum Corda renamed Northwest 1 in Ward 6 and Park Morton in Ward 1, both in Northwest DC. The Park Morton project was supposed to be handled differently, but once again, the city is preparing to tear down the homes of public housing residents before the new units was ready for them to move in. More than 100 families who were still in Park Morton apartments were ready to move right after the Housing Authority began offering them housing vouchers in the fall of 2020. Some residents said that it made a difficult choice for them. Stay in housing that's become uninhabitable or risk leaving a neighborhood that they loved because they may never be able to afford to come back. ParkviewDC.com is a blog that highlights everything about the Parkview neighborhood in Northwest DC. In 2015, ParkviewDC.com detailed the story of a meeting Mayor Bowser had with the Park Morton residents, and she took questions on a number of issues including crime, modernizing the schools, recreation center improvements, vacant and blighted properties, bike lanes, and the redevelopment of Park Morton. There was a notable focus on crime, public safety, and sustained law enforcement initiatives. During the public safety discussion, officers of both the 3rd and 4th District Police Departments spoke specifically about actions that they were taking in the community. As expected, the subject of the Park Morton redevelopment and the use of the Bruce Monroe Park as part of the project came up and was the focus of much of the conversation. Mayor Bowser stated that the redevelopment of Park Morton is a long-standing commitment and is a part of the New Communities Initiative. A major part of the New Communities goals is to not displace residents from their current neighborhoods by building replacement housing first. Leading into the discussion on the selection of the Bruce Monroe Park as the best available option for the Build First location, the mayor asked if people had looked up and down Georgia Avenue for available land. The room erupted with lots of people shouting out suggestions of privately owned property and alternative parcels of land. Order was quickly regained and the New Communities Director, Angie Rogers, provided an overview of where things currently stood in the process. The mayor also stated that whatever happens at the Bruce Monroe location, it will include park space as part of the plan, and that she wouldn't support any proposal that didn't have a park in it. Even at this stage, in year 2015, there was still no timeline for breaking ground as of yet. The meeting closed with Ms. Shantae High speaking about her concerns with the redevelopment of Park Morton. As a resident of the complex, Ms. High expressed concerns about being displaced and being safe. She also commented that all the residents of Park Morton deserve to be treated fairly. Ms. Shantae High is not only a resident of Park Morton, she's also the president of the council at Park Morton. It's a group of people made up of the residents that represent all of Park Morton's residents. The Washington Informer newspaper wrote an article on Ms. Shantae High in July 2022, explaining in full detail the state of affairs with Park Morton, its residents, and the DC government. The article states that Ms. Shantae High refuses to leave her apartment that's scheduled for demolition unless she's provided a housing voucher. She said the D.C. government and D.C. council member Brianne Nadeau from Ward 1 prevented the full execution of an equity plan that she had developed in 2019 for Park Morton's redevelopment. Some of the items from the extended list included in Ms. Shantae High's plan is to build first, full rights for all Park Morton residents to return, larger unit sizes to accommodate families, create more than 133 new permanent career opportunities for returning residents, and affordable units must remain affordable during the lifespan of the project. Since the D.C. government, the D.C. Housing Authority, and developers solidified the deal in 2007, hundreds of families have left Park Morton and moved into other dwellings across the D.C. metropolitan area. The nearly 24 families who remained recently moved from their home into other apartments in the complex, while the developers demolished another portion of Park Morton to make way for the new buildings. However, one of the apartments that's in the queue for demolition hasn't been torn down yet, because Shantae High is the sole occupant of the building and she said she refuses to leave. She's currently involved in a legal battle with the D.C. Housing Authority. As president of the council at Park Morton, High created the Park Morton Equity Plan with input from the residents. Ms. High has said the D.C. government and D.C. council member Brianne Nadeau not only prevented the full implementation of the Park Morton Equity Plan, but accelerated the demolition of the Park Morton apartments in order to move forward with the project once stalled because of insufficient funds. Ms. High is quoted as saying, "We were trying to create true self-sufficiency. The D.C. Housing Authority has a self-sufficiency program, but they aren't using it in a manner to truly help residents get off government programs and become middle and upper class citizens. This is what the equity plan means," she said. "We were diverse at Park Morton. With apartments priced at 50 to 80% average median income, you're pushing us out." Once completed, Park Morton will have 542 housing units, a third of which will be replacement housing for Park Morton residents. The other 2/3 will have income restrictions. Units originally designated as market rate now serve as affordable housing units at 80% average median income. The D.C. Housing Authority has said that residents who have lived in Park Morton since 2007 can return if they choose to. Councilwoman Nadeau said of the Park Morton Equity Plan created by Ms. Shantae High, "It couldn't have been totally included in a redevelopment because it came out well after the D.C. government, D.C. Housing Authority, and private developers had already finalized the plans for Park Morton." The Park Morton redevelopment is one of 4 projects under D.C.'s New Communities Initiative, where severely dilapidated subsidized housing becomes redeveloped into mixed income communities. The initiative strives to maintain the same number of available units with one-for-one replacements. It also attempts to prevent displacement through Build First, where developers build new housing before tearing down dilapidated buildings. Initially, the Park Morton project had 3 phases. During the first phase, Build First would take place on the construction of replacement housing on Georgia Avenue and Columbia Road. The next phase would focus on the apartment buildings on Park Road and the Park Morton cul-de-sac. The Build First part of the project was delayed because of a lawsuit that stopped the construction at the site of the former Bruce Monroe Elementary School, now the Bruce Monroe Park, because the school was torn down late 2009. Throughout the years, as more Park Morton residents accepted housing vouchers and moved away, a growing number of apartment buildings in the complex became empty. Because of the now empty buildings, that gave cause for the demolition of some of the apartment buildings the first week of May 2022. ParkviewDC.com gives us a historical view of Park Morton as a neighborhood beginning in the mid-1950s. A growing commitment to eradicate slums in American cities, which included Los Angeles, New Orleans, Pasadena, and Kansas City, Missouri, had shown enough promise that the National Association of Real Estate Boards had launched a blight elimination program under the slogan, "No Slums by 1960." Then the decision was made to eradicate the slums of DC's Southwest neighborhood through a massive urban renewal program. The redevelopment of Southwest displaced hundreds of black families and required the construction of new replacement housing. One of the earliest developments planned to replace these housing for black families was Park Morton. In May 1957, DC commissioners agreed to schedule a public hearing for the proposed 174-unit public housing development to be located in Northwest Washington. By this time, the National Capital Housing Authority had already conducted surveys of potential locations, narrowing it down to the 600 and 700 blocks of Morton Street. Ultimately, the 600 block of Morton Street will be the better location for the project, and that it could consist of 3-story walk-up apartment buildings. At the time, the site was occupied by a store, partially destroyed by fire, and 81 buildings considered to be in poor condition. Most of the buildings were row houses, and many of them among the oldest structures in the neighborhood. That hearing on May 24, 1957, was attended by both supporters and those in opposition. In addition to the Housing Authority, supporters of the Morton Street development included the Washington Urban League, the Washington Housing Association, the Federation of Businessmen's Association, and the Urban Renewal Council. Opposition to the project included Herman Schmidt of the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Washington, Nelson Roots, who was also the president of the Pleasant Plains Civic Association, and also 22 other residents. Among the neighbors speaking in opposition was Raymond C. Lewis, who lived on Water Street, and complained about having undesirables moving into the new project from the Southwest slum clearance area. As a result of the hearing, the district commissioners decided to defer action on the project pending more study. Yet this put federal funding in jeopardy with a 2-month deadline for the Housing Authority's funding for a total of 1,500 units of public housing that the district was required to provide. At that time, the 174 units on Morton Street were the only units that had been proposed. Finally, the district commissioners gave their approval on the Morton Street project on June 27, 1957, giving the green light to the Housing Authority to seek an advance planning loan from the Federal Public Housing Administration for appraisal of the existing 81 buildings that needed to be purchased and bulldozed. While this was good news for the Morton Street project, it was still necessary for the district to find locations for the remaining 1,326 public housing units critically needed for families being displaced from the Southwest slums. Despite the critical need for housing, the project still had delays. Immediately after approval by the district commissioners, the Washington House Home Builders Association requested to sidetrack the project, even as the Housing Authority was actively acquiring property on Morton Street and Park Road. The next challenge to the Park Morton was identified in July 1958, when the Housing Authority discovered that their design for the new apartments was in direct conflict with the new 1958 district zoning regulations, which had gone into effect months earlier in May. The old rules would have permitted a group of apartments with separate outside entrances and division walls to be considered the same as one big building with connecting halls inside. as Park Morton was not designed to be one large building, but rather a collection of smaller buildings. The planners requested a reinstatement of the earlier zoning provision from the Zoning Commission. The design's conflict with the zoning regulations was not resolved until mid-1959. In April of 1960, Blake Construction Company was declared the low bidder with a bid to build the 12 three-story buildings at Park Morton for $1.6 million. Construction started in May with a planned completion date for 18 months later. However, as construction was nearing completion, the District Highway Department and the Housing Authority clashed over the issue of tree removal. The Highway Department wanted to remove 18 mature shade trees located along the curbside of the development. In response, the National Capital Planning Commission declared that there's nothing worse than a brand new raw building with skinny little trees around it. Also supporting the retention of the trees was Housing Authority Executive Director Walter E. Washington. Many years later, he became DC's first elected mayor with one term from 1975 to 1979. Washington urged that each of the 18 trees be considered on a tree-by-tree basis, with only dead or dying trees be removed. Park Morton was finally completed in November 1961. It was among the first affordable housing developments planned and completed by the Housing Authority for families displaced by urban renewal in Southwest DC. It also represented a new trend in affordable housing. Instead of large developments with numerous stories, smaller houses, three-story walk-up apartments, and garden apartments were more favorable. The goal was to create an informal pattern of buildings that avoided monotony and would be grouped around grass and play areas. The architects Keyes, Lethbridge, and Condon were recognized in 1964 by the Federal Public Housing Administration with a special commendation for Park Morton's facade treatment, which included balconies. While the General Accounting Office later took issue with Park Morton's balconies as an unnecessary expense, the GAO itself was criticized for its nitpicking and making war on decent housing for poor people. For their part, the Housing Authority was defended and praised in the press for what they accomplished at Park Morton. An article published in 1966 had said, "Fortunately for Washington, the Housing Authority realized that the cost of good architecture is very small compared to its benefits. When the building itself is an example of poverty and neglect, its tenants will neglect it. When the building is attractive, its tenants will respond. Even in purely fiscal terms, a dreary building is a blight on its surroundings, and the blight is eventually reflected in assessments. A handsome project like Park Morton sets a standard of excellence for the entire neighborhood. Balconies are good for people. Balconies are good for the city." While unacknowledged by many people today, Park Morton was successful architecturally and thrived through the 1970s. Its eventual decline had much to do with the impact of outside forces on its residents, such as the crack drug epidemic of the 1980s. And with the Housing Authority's inability to help keep the buildings in good repair than they did with the initial design of the apartments. A lot has happened in 2020 related to the redeveloping of Park Morton. Some of it's positive, some of it's disappointing, and much of it is just causing confusion. The entire redevelopment plan of Park Morton is complex, split over 2 locations in a mix of local and federal jurisdictions. The temporary park space that was once the site of the Bruce Monroe Elementary School, located on Georgia Avenue, was selected as the original Build First location for the Park Morton redevelopment project. The Bruce Monroe portion of the project is significant because it would provide 273 affordable units, including 189 in an apartment building, 76 in a senior building, and 8 townhomes. Of the 273 units, 90 units will be replacement homes for Park Morton residents. The site would also create a permanent 1-acre park along Columbia Road. The planned buildings for the Bruce Monroe location required zoning relief from the city for greater density because they were part of a planned unit development, meaning that the developers needed the zoning standards to change in order for this project to move forward because of the added amenities that would come along with the deal. One reason many people supported the planned unit development was that the larger building made it possible to create the park. As the property is Washington, D.C. property, far less zoning relief would have been needed if the entire location was developed into housing, and it did not include a public green space. Despite opposition from certain residents about the Bruce Monroe location, redevelopment was supported by local neighborhood associations, advisory neighborhood commissions 1A and 1B, the Park Morton Resident Council, DC's City Council, and it was approved by the Zoning Commission in March 2017. To prevent the project from moving forward, 3 neighbors, originally 4, challenged the Bruce Monroe zoning order in court on May 30th, 2017, arguing that the planned buildings were too large and that the Zoning Commission didn't correctly translate many of DC's land use laws in order to approve the 2 projects. The case was argued in court on February 14th, 2019, and the judges finally decided the case on June 25th, 2020, with the result being that the court vacated the zoning order and remanded the case to go back to the Zoning Commission for reconsideration. In short, both the appeals and the remand have seriously delayed the Phase 1 of the original plan, resulting in the original Phase 2 of the redevelopment to now be the first phase of the development. Based on information from the January 23, 2020 Park Morton Committee meeting, the plan to redevelop Park Morton has been adjusted to allow the project to move forward, while the Bruce Monroe part is still being sorted out. The location of the planned larger apartment building is on Park Road and will replace 2 empty Park Morton buildings on Park Road and other buildings which are still occupied. I went back to Park Morton to photograph an update on August 25th, 2022, and at that point a few buildings has been cleared on the Park Road section of the complex. But before demolition began, housing needed to be coordinated for several residents who lived in the impacted buildings, and the DC Housing Authority had already begun offering housing vouchers and have been relocating residents who choose to move off-site or use the second option, which was for residents to move to vacant apartments in buildings that were not be affected by the demolition. There was another slight hiccup in the Park Morton rebuild in June 2021, when Mayor Bowser was making major changes in the plans from redevelopment in favor of rehabilitation. The DC Housing Authority has spent several years moving families off the property in preparation for the demolition, but according to the mayor's 2022 budget proposal, the city was hoping to spend just over $15 million to make Park Morton livable for residents again, since the conditions had deteriorated very much over the decades. John Falsicchio, Mayor Bowser's Chief of Staff and Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, believes the renovation would proceed more quickly than the redevelopment, which has been stuck in limbo for years. The mayor's plan involved changing the ownership structure of the federally owned property through the Federal Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, leveraging the $15 million in city funds to pull in private investment. Falsicchio said that the move is necessary because the city hasn't found the money to support the redevelopment. The reactions to this news has not been favorable. Housing activists and Councilwoman Brianne Nadeau were shocked by this decision. Seeing the change as a betrayal of promises the city has long made to Park Morton residents. Newdall wrote in a statement to the Washington Business Journal that she believes there is no other option than to follow through on the plans to build 189 new units on the property. After all these years, this is a fight I'm not walking away from. The remaining residents at Park Morton were equally perplexed by this news. Shantae High said she isn't opposed to the rehabilitation concept, but can't understand why the city spent so much time pursuing a redevelopment deal just to switch this late in the game. DC officials have argued as far back as 2005 that the property needed a total overhaul. Ms. High is quoted as saying, "My property could have been rehabbed 14 or 15 years ago, so all of this time has been wasted dilly-dallying around. Now, half of the property hasn't been maintained in years. It's wasted away to the point where it's going to have to be torn down." John Falsicchio told the Washington Business Journal that the administration had reversed its decision after the public denounced Mayor Bowser's new proposal. Mayor Bowser made the requested changes to the budget days later by adding $23 million to the initial $15 million for Park Morton's redevelopment. Park Morton was slated for completion back in 2015, and demolition just began in 2022 without Build First housing. At Berry Farms, residents were given housing vouchers and asked to move before their homes were torn down and rebuilt. But as of September 2022, Old Berry Farm residents still wait for construction. At Temple Courts, residents were promised that they could return to a revitalized neighborhood. More than 10 years later, some former residents have moved into replacement housing units in the neighborhood. But the planned complex with 211 homes for these residents have remained a parking lot for years. Ground was broken in 2020. Park Morton was to fare better than the rest, but it seems to fall to the same fate. Shantae High's complaints mount with each passing day and slow actions of the DC Housing Authority. Among her complaints was that the residents were informed about a new building blocks away from Park Morton called the Avenue. This building was promised as a Build First replacement building, but as she said, "We got stiffed." Ms. High has said she presented two properties as suitable replacements that would honor the agreement of keeping families in Ward 1, one property on Lamont Street and another on Florida Avenue. But still her suggestions were rejected. Ms. High has staged two protests in 2020, one in February and the second in August. She's been fighting for tenants' rights with TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. She questions the motives of government officials and the DC Housing Authority with the greed of gentrification. She's not the only tenant who feels as if DC government is pushing residents out of the complex without a guaranteed future to stay in their own neighborhood. Ms. High is quoted as saying that the DC Housing Authority wants to continue the oppression because they don't want to discuss or comply with the Park Morton equity plan. Ms. High has said she has presented solutions to avoid the many delays and disruptions to the redevelopment process. She's pointed out that the number 640 and the 630 buildings have been boarded up for decades. She said that these two buildings could have long been torn down and rebuilt as LECs, limited equity co-ops, and used as the Build First location years ago. This would allow residents who couldn't afford to pay out of pocket to collectively pool their money together and purchase within the LEC and effectively staying in their community. Ms. Haya said she has presented her equity plan to DC government back in February 2019, but they won't put anything in writing while consistently making lots of promises, and she feels the reason why is because it will uplift families out of generational poverty by being self-sufficient. Ms. has an online petition with change.org that she will present to the DC Council and the mayor. So if you agree with the Park Morton equity plan in helping residents return to their homes after the rebuild, help out the community by signing the petition. I have. What do you think should happen at Park Morton? Is Shantae Hyde correct in her complaints, or is she just being a nuisance? If you've ever lived in DC or you currently live in DC, voice your opinion on this situation. If you have ever lived in Park Morton, can you tell me, what does the Park Morton 640 really mean? It has to mean more than just a number on an apartment building. Represent your hood by leaving a comment and let us know, what has it been like living there? What type of community family have you made by living there? And I want to thank Terrence for this comment alerting me to the demolition when it started in May 2022. I drove over there many times so far to keep track of the progress. So of course, I will keep you updated on the progress on this development that lies between Park Road and Morton Street. I'm Dickie D, and I want to thank you for hanging out with me in another part of DC. And I will see you in another video.